It has been a long year indeed. Many of us have carried an incredible burden over the last year, but it's also been a long 4 years. I think about all that we have carried in this moment. COVID-19, a global pandemic, that has now taken in the last 10 months, 1 out of every 750 Black and Indigenous lives in the United States. I'll say that number again because it's hard to hold and imagine. 1 out of every 750 Black people and 1 out of every 750 Indigenous people here in the United States has now died from COVID-19 in the last 11 months. But it's not just the pandemic. It's the economic instability that we face as a nation due to that pandemic and due to income inequality in our society. The disparity of wealth. Currently in the United States, at least 31 million Americans are out of work. The number is likely much higher. Those who have long given up on the opportunity of employment in this country. But it's not just a pandemic and economic instability. It's the rise of political violence. We witnessed that rise last Wednesday on January 6th in Washington, D.C., where the alt-right, driven by a white nationalist ideology, attempted a coup in our nation's capital. We've carried so much, and I know that we are exhausted, but I'm not here to speak about the darkness. I'm here to talk about the darkness because, as Martin Luther King Jr. once told us, it is in the darkness that we begin to understand the importance of the light, that it's in the darkness that we begin to find our way forward. And so this evening, I want to speak to that darkness, but not to pull us in and to trap us, not to weigh us down. We speak about the darkness today so that we can find our way forward, our way from the mountaintop into the promised land. This story of white nationalism doesn't begin last week, nor does it begin 4 years ago. It has been a long road for the white nationalist movement from the margins to the mainstream. It begins within the victories of the 1965 civil rights movement. And I'll explain. You all may remember this thing called the civil rights movement, particularly you in North Carolina. We were told in school of a woman by the name of Rosa Parks. Rosa Parks was a Black woman who on one day was tired. And on that one day that she was tired, I was taught in school, she decided not to give up her seat. And because she decided not to give up her seat, she was arrested. And lo and behold, almost like manna from heaven, the entire Black community in Montgomery, Alabama, suddenly knew to stay off the city buses. Not only did they know through osmosis to stay off the city buses, but they suddenly knew to give each other a ride back and forth to work, not just for a day, not just for a month, but for nearly an entire year. Indeed, it was one of the greatest miracles to ever take place in the United States. Then after that year, we are told, the Montgomery Bus Association simply decided that segregation was wrong and ended it, and that everyone lived happily ever after. Now we know that's not the story of Rosa Parks. Neither is it the story of civil rights in this country. Rosa Parks was a long respected leader in her community. She was a civil rights organizer, the secretary of the NAACP in her community. We also know now that she and others had gathered in a place outside of Knoxville, Tennessee, called the Highlander Center for Research and Education. And she and other civil rights organizers had gathered together to try to understand how they challenged the spiritual sin of segregation in American society. We know now that Rosa Parks was not the first to be arrested. Many were arrested before her. Many attempted to be arrested before her. But she was the person that ignited the community. No one quite understands, but they know that if they did not have those relationships in place, if they had not practiced, if they had not stretched and leaned, that they would not have been able to galvanize not only the civil rights movement in Montgomery, Alabama, but across the country. This civil rights movement was victorious in destroying white supremacy as the rule of law. When we talk about white supremacy, what we mean is a system of discrimination that was both historic and present day. That it was a system built off the idea of white superiority, that white people were superior than other people merely based on the color of their skin. Why was this belief in white superiority so important? Why did our society need to socialize people into believing that they were inferior or superior off the basis of their skin? Well, it's because of the way that society chose to organize. You see, white superiority was critical to allowing three things to happen in this land. The first was the stolen resources and lives of Native people. The second was a system of chattel slavery. And the third, not often addressed, was misogyny, the control of sexuality, and primarily the control of women and sexual minorities in the United States. It is these three pillars that make the United States part of the abundant economy that it is today. It came at the sacrifice of generations of lives who were faced into a form of slavery that was so brutal that it was called the peculiar institution, a system that intentionally sought over generations to deny Black people their humanity, a system that allowed until the 1970s in this country the physical beating of women simply because they had entered into marriage. It was a system that allowed the systemic killing of Native people in one of the largest genocides to ever take place in this continent. White supremacy marched across this land before there was even a United States of America. It is this white supremacy that was challenged by the civil rights movement. Now, I want everyone to take a deep breath. I have to tell you something. None of us need feel guilty for that system. None of us are responsible for that system of white supremacy. None of us were here when it was established. Our only obligation is to challenge its present day ramifications and to take it on in our lives, to rid it from our society. But it is that system of white supremacy that was defeated by the civil rights movement of the 1960s. Now, I'm of a younger generation. I came up in the post-civil rights movement. I didn't understand the choiceless choices of my parents and of my grandparents. Indeed, in the height of the Black Lives Matters movement, there was a very popular t-shirt that was circulating, and many of my friends would wear it. And it said, "Not my mama's civil rights movement," pointing to the 1960s. As I learned about the civil rights movement, I began to tease my friends back. And I would tell them, "You're right. We aren't our mother's civil rights movement. Our mother's civil rights movement was badass." And what I mean by that is that our mother's civil rights movement had to function in a society when white supremacy was uncontested as the rule of law. It was the only lens upon which we were allowed to see and interpret our society. Whether we are talking about economics, whether we are talking about religion, Whether we are talking about arts and culture or politics, white supremacy was the uncontested God. And along came these humble Black Southerners and their allies from around the country, many of them disproportionately Jewish. Now, I'm not here to draw rainbows and unicorns about the Black-Jewish relationship, but I do want to point out that Jews were present in that fight, and they were allies, but they also had their own skin in the game. For you see, many of the Jews who participated disproportionately in that civil rights movement were the descendants or the survivors of another form of racism in Europe, a form of anti-Jewish bigotry known as anti-Semitism. The idea that Jews were of another race, not merely of another religion. These brothers and sisters and others joined with Southern Blacks, and they won significant policy, the Voting Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act, but also the Immigration Reform Act that overturned white supremacist policy at the federal level. It was immigration and refugee laws that prevented Jews from fleeing Europe to safety to the United States. Indeed, Anne Frank's family was turned back from the United States, where many of them ended up perishing at the hands of Nazi Europe. It was a significant victory. But imagine for a second, imagine that you are an arch segregationist. You believe Black people are inferior in every way. How then do you come to terms with the fact that you just lost to Black people? And not only lost, but lost significantly. For you see, this civil rights movement of the 1960s brought uncontested white supremacy upon a field where it could be contested, where it would be challenged, not just by African Americans, but by religious minorities, by Muslims, by immigrants, by Latinos, by women, by the trans community. It is these Blacks in the South and their Jewish allies who carved the path for where we stand today. For these arch segregationists, they were never going to allow that they lost to Black people. They had been socialized too long. Their hearts had been hardened in such a way that they would never give Black people their agency, never recognize the legitimate grievances that they held. This is why I say, if white supremacy is about a system of discrimination, white nationalism was the answer to the defeat of that segregation by Black people and their allies. For them, the answer became that Jews were responsible, borrowing from the old writings, anti-Semitic fake writings of the protocols of the elders of Zion. These new white nationalists in the late 60s began to construct a new narrative. While we hear the term the alt-right, a broad coalition that is made up of authoritarians around the country, we should understand that at the core of that movement is white nationalism. If white supremacy is a system, white nationalism is a social movement. It is the antithetical social movement to the civil rights movement in this country. And anti-Semitism is at its core. It is not just one of the core. It is the core of its ideology. And anti-Semitism is so central to white nationalism that I believe that Black people and other marginalized groups will never win our freedom if we're not also active in the struggle to uproot anti-Jewish hate. Amongst 21st century white nationalists, Jews are cast in the same role they have always filled for anti-Semites, as the absolute other, demons stirring a pot of lesser evils, and the driving force behind white dispossession. At the foundation of this modern day movement is the explicit claim that Jews are a separate race, not a religious other, and that this position as white is framed as the greatest trick the devil has ever played. For white nationalists, Jews, despite and indeed because many are perceived as white, are cast as an enemy race that must be exposed and eliminated. It is this fantasy of invisible Jewish power that explains for the white nationalist movement how Black Americans, a race of supposed inferiors, could orchestrate the end of Jim Crow, how feminists in the LGBTQ community could upend traditional gender roles, and how immigrant workers could mount a successful challenge to economic inequality in the United States. Folks often ask me, where is the anti-Semitism in the white nationalist movement? I tell folks that it's everywhere. When the Tree of Life shooter said Jews were committing a genocide against white people, he was using a language that was intimately familiar to his fellow white nationalists. Such rabid anti-Semitism is the framework in which the entire white nationalist movement functions. Now, I'm not saying that everyone within the white nationalist movement or in the alt-right coalition is a hardened anti-Semite. What I'm saying is that the narrative that they use to justify anti-democratic tendencies, authoritarianism, and the dehumanization of others is driven by an anti-Semitic narrative. Many of us are familiar with QAnon, a vast conspiracy that has been spreading around the country, infecting people, children, adults, and others. The QAnon conspiracy frames Donald Trump as a hero who is secretly warring against a political elite, a conspiratorial cabal that controls finance, culture, and politics, that uses democratic practice in order to exploit and take advantage of children sexually. It is that conspiracy that has led to violence and murder across the United States. For many of us, we hear this narrative and it doesn't make sense. But it doesn't make sense if you don't understand anti-Semitism. If you understand anti-Semitism, you understand that QAnon is just a modern day version of that Protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion. The Protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion was created as a document in the early 1900s. This may sound parallel, but it was created by Russian secret police who were afraid about the spread of democracy in Europe. And they used it to sow dissension and to divide communities in order to maintain power amongst the kings and princes and queens and royalty of Europe. The protocols purported to tell a story, the story of Jewish elders who gathered in a cemetery at midnight to plot the takeover of the world and the destruction of European Christendom. Eventually, the protocols were brought back to Russia. And then those Russian immigrants who came to the United States brought the protocols with them. It's a powerful narrative. While false and dangerous, it continues to resonate. Even then it resonated. Eventually, a man by the name of Henry Ford, an automobile industrialist who brought forth the mass production of the automobile, came across the protocols. He was taken by the narrative. It fed his already latent anti-Semitism. Henry Ford was so moved by the protocols that he republished them in a series of essays in his newspaper that was distributed in Ford dealerships across the country. It is that narrative that began to seed the white nationalist movement before it was even born. For white nationalists, anti-Semitism explains the world. They not only explains the world for them, but it motivates them to violence. Whether we are talking about the attacks on Latinos in El Paso at a Walmart, or the attacks on Sikhs in Wisconsin, driven by hatred of Muslims, or the attacks on Black worshipers in a church in Charleston, South Carolina, or Jews worshiping in Pittsburgh. While yes, anti-Black racism was evident, anti-Latino bigotry, and Islamophobia, we have to understand that for each of those killers, not only were they othering those who have survived racism and white supremacy in America, but they also saw themselves at war, in an existential war against the Jewish community. It is why I often argue that anti-Semitism is not merely a threat to the Jewish community, but to non-Jews as well. It has taken many lives at this point. And I think about Martin Luther King, and I think about this moment and how dark it feels. As we head towards inauguration, we hear warnings of increased political violence. I can't tell you that those warnings aren't true. Indeed, we at Western State Center and at the Southern Poverty Law Center, and my colleagues at the Anti-Defamation League, and many other civil rights leaders are very concerned about the political violence. But we're also angry. We're angry because we understand that anti-Semitism, racism, homophobia, sexism, and anti-Muslim bigotry don't come to our communities brought by white nationalists and others, that they simply organize the bigotry that already exists. We are angry because for far too long, we have left ourselves vulnerable. I think of a young alt-right activist in Portland, Oregon, who took part in a demonstration here about 4 years ago. I remember watching him being harangued by a citizen reporter with a video camera stuck in the face of this alt-right activist. And I remember him shouting at this activist saying, "Why are you here in Portland? No one wants you here. The mayor doesn't want you here. These protesters don't want you here. I don't want you here. Why are you here?" And what that young alt-right activist said should haunt us all. He replied to that person, "Yes, I've heard you don't want us here. But the truth is," he said, "Portland is a city with a shrinking Black population by both percentage and whole number." He went on to clip, "You can say you don't want us here, but the fact of the matter is you are doing something we could never do. You are disappearing the Black population of Portland." In short, he was calling us hypocrites. He was telling us that our inability and our unwillingness to address the systemic racism of this moment has left us vulnerable. We saw this all too well in Washington, D.C., where law enforcement officers, elected officials, and others chose their ideology over the rule of law, chose authoritarianism over the common good, and chose their implicit bias over their mission to protect and serve and to defend the Constitution. When we ask ourselves, how did the white nationalist movement move from the margins to the mainstream from 1968 to 2021? We have to be brave enough to first pick up the mirror and to take a deep look. We have often used our idea of neutrality, The idea that somehow there is an equal battle going on our side between racial justice activists and those who would like to engage in ethnic cleansing. We pretend that saying Black Lives Matters is controversial. We turn our backs on young Black and Jewish activists who are struggling to figure out this world and to move it forward to a place of hope, safety, and prosperity. In short, we have spent our time navel gazing, and our country has paid the price. I am enraged around the moment we are in right now. I think about that massacre down in Charleston, South Carolina, where white nationalist Dylann Roof gunned down 9 Black lives during a Bible study session he had been welcome to attend. I remember the words he later wrote. I would like to make crystal clear, I do not regret what I did, he said. Have not shed a tear for the innocent people I killed. I share a tear tonight, not just for those congregants, but for all those whose lives have been lost over these years. I shed a tear that we chose not to align and stand in solidarity until things were so bleak that we didn't know the way forward. When I find a place for the rage and grief, I have to look towards Martin Luther King. And I think of his speech, I've been to the mountaintop. It was the last speech that Martin Luther King Jr. gave. We all remember that speech on April 4th, 1968. Dr. King was murdered that day outside his Memphis motel room, also assassinated by a white nationalist. Martin Luther King left this earth that day, never receiving the majority of support from the American public. We should remember that today, Black Lives Matter receives more support from white America than Martin Luther King did while he walked the earth. This is an important day for us to remember, and it should never be forgotten. It was that day before, when Martin Luther King was still with us, that he was speaking to an overflowed room. Here's what he said. If the Almighty said to me, which age would I like to live in? Strangely enough, I would turn to the Almighty and say, if you allow me to live just a few years in the second half of the 20th century, I will be happy. I can imagine him saying those words. And I remember the other things he said, asking us and reminding us that he had been to the mountaintop. I wrote recently during this period that I can feel that mountain and I can see us climbing it. We are struggling to reach the top. And I know in this moment as I speak to you, that climb feels long, it feels muddy, and the rocks are making us weary. And we all know weary, don't we? I don't have to tell you about weary. The aches and tears of the weary in a way that our country is struggling to comprehend. The weary that comes in the form of racist brutality, bodies broken by bullets, gas, slurs, and the ropes around the limbs of trees. The weary that comes from hunger, neglectful healthcare, and stolen dreams. We understand Martin Luther King's weary that comes from disrespect and invisibility. But I want to take you back to Memphis that night. And I want to take you back to that mountainside. And I want you to understand and imagine Dr. King is right here with us. We know he is weary as we are. And he tells us he is not sure he will be able to make that climb with us. But he tells us that it doesn't matter. He isn't worried about anything. You see, he knows he is going to be killed. And you can hear it in the shaking but determined quake of his voice. As sure as he knows that, he knows another truth as well. Looking at all of us climbing, struggling to hang on, he tells us, I've been to the mountaintop. I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know that we, as a people, will get to the promised land. The promised land can feel far from view when white nationalists drive insurrection in our nation's capitals, when they attack our houses of worship. But leading in times of easiness is well easy, isn't it? But these times aren't them. In truth, we all know what we are witnessing right now. We just don't want to say it out loud. We are witnessing the end of one age and the beginning of another. These are the times of great beauty, but also times of great horror. While the new world is unfolding, we still walk amidst an old world that has not yet realized that the binary is no longer needed. Martin Luther King said, quote, another reason I'm happy to live in this period is that we have been forced to a point where we are going to have to grapple with the problems that men have been trying to grapple with through history, but the demands didn't force them to do it, quote. I want to tell each of you listening, it is a heavy lift to walk between two worlds. I feel the pressure on my shoulders and the nudge of pain in my middle back. I feel it in the tears that fall slowly from the corner of my eyes as I speak to you right now. I think you may feel it too. How does it affect our climb towards justice, opportunity, and true democracy in America? How do we lead in such a moment? How do we not only walk our talk, but help others to do so as well? We lead in this moment by understanding that we too can see the promised land. We are no longer climbing for ourselves. Here today, we climb for our ancestors and for the generations to come. They are worthy of our sacrifices at this moment. So I encourage you all today to climb not out of fear, but because we choose abundance over scarcity, inclusion over violence, and love over death. We climb knowing that we don't get to the promised land unless we bring everyone with us across the mountaintop. So here we all stand today at the mountaintop, barely able to see what's ahead of us because we have to keep looking back, waiting for too many people to join us, not just for a night of protest, but for the long work of the climb. Can you hear me tonight? I'm calling on you to climb just a little bit more. You see, it's your freedom too. It's the freedom that Black people have been climbing for hundreds of years. It's been paid for with 500 years of indigenous and African blood. Can you hear us tonight? There is nothing to fear, and it's time for you to move. No more rehearsals. This is the actual event, and we are determined that we get over the mountaintop this time. How about you? Stand up, get moving. History will judge you. This is your opportunity to join the 21st century civil rights movement. Welcome, and we embrace you. It's time to move. Thank you.